Evening, everyone. Hello. So, yes, we're going to have our debrief, as we often do when there's been by-elections, because there's often by-elections these days. There's going to be more in the new year, all very exciting. But these ones were the most. It was the most exciting by-election since North Shropshire at the end of 2021, which, of course, is what, as far as I was concerned, sealed Boris Johnson's fate, because that was North Shropshire was a seat that the Tories had held. Like these days we talk about the Tories and the Conservatives. It's the same party now. Wasn't then. There was no such thing as the Conservative Party when the Tories, which is what their official party name was, first took North Shropshire. The Conservative Party only came into being in its modern form few years later, 2 or 3 years later. So the Conservatives, the Tories, had held that seat for all that time, since like 1830 something, and then they lost it. That was incredible. The Mid-Bedfordshire was very much the same thing. I'll go through some of the questions that are related to this. So, we're going to go through this. There's lots to go through in actual fact. That I haven't already in certain videos, now that I've had time to go through things in a bit more detail. So Brad's just mentioned Jeremy Hunt standing down. Now, we don't know, by the way, that Jeremy Hunt's going to stand down. However, if he does stand down, that actually makes things very messy. So I'm going to discuss that in a video tomorrow, because in actual fact, the report we're reading, if it turns out to be true, and obviously there's no announcement and there's not expected to be an announcement anytime soon, Jeremy Hunt is completely screwing his party over, completely screwing it. Tom's saying there, love the snappy short format content. So I might discuss the shorts a bit later. I'll probably do it in like a subscriber video, some evening next week, what I'm aiming to do with the shorts. When I've worked it out myself. But let's just go through a few things about the by-elections that I may not have mentioned so far. First thing I want to point out is in terms of effort. So if you looked at the last week, obviously most of you won't have been following it too closely, but if you were following the activities of both Labour and the Conservatives, what you noticed is in both Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire, the big names in Labour were out there every day. Not to say each individual was there every day, but every single day in Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire, you had some major figures in the Labour Party. Right at the top, you had like Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Louise Haig, various people going there to help campaign. Now, who did the Tories have? They had Greg Hands. That was it. Greg Hands. The party chair, who's in charge, of course, of coordinating campaigns. Where were the rest of the cabinet? Now, we know Rishi Sunak was abroad, and James Cleverly, as the Foreign Secretary, was, of course, abroad as well. And we can say, OK, we can understand that. Where's the rest? Where was Swilla Braverman? Where was Grant Shapps? Where was Gillian effing Dunkeegan? Where were the rest of them? Why was no one campaigning for the Conservatives other than Greg Hands and, of course, their grassroots support? So the Conservatives, like the senior Conservatives, are making no effort. Like they're not even trying to appeal to voters. Then there were lots of anonymous statements from Tory MPs. Some of them very much puffing on the copium and saying, oh, it's just Tory voters stayed home, which is exactly what Tory MPs were saying in 1996. And they were going, oh, they'll be out in force come the general election. Yeah, well, they weren't in 1997 and they're not going to be this time either. But then there were others who were not trying to delude themselves, seemingly. They were ones who were going, no, these results are really bad and, we have to do something about it. But the thing is, the ones who were saying we need to do something really different were just as deluded as those saying we need to do nothing at all. Because if you look at what they're calling for more right-wing policies. So basically they're saying, in order to attract voters back, we need to move further to the right. Now, if you consider what's happening, the public at the moment are saying, We want a Labour government. So effectively, voters are looking left, politically speaking, for their solutions. Now, it doesn't mean that they're all moving to the left, literally. It just means most voters are grouped around the centre. Labour have now captured the centre ground. The Conservatives are still not attempting to occupy the centre ground. So in reality, all that's happening is voters are saying, look, we like the parties that are focusing on the centre. But from the point of view of like shifts, that means moving left. So the Conservatives' answer to this is to move even further to the right, which makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. But anyway, let's try and go through a few things there. Sunak could schedule the next election to be in the same week as the US presidential election. There'd be less media scrutiny as the media will all focus on the US presidential election. No, it wouldn't. It really wouldn't. And also, as I did in my video today, if he thought he could get some benefit, he would. The thing is, Rishi Sunak needs the media attention on him. Like, I keep saying, like Boris Johnson in 2019 did a lot of hiding away. That's because he was ahead. He had to just not mess things up. He was ahead. Rishi Sunak's going to be behind. So Rishi Sunak needs the focus on him. Because the way that polls tighten is he has to actually get messages out to the public. So, for example, if they did have the general election in January, that means the campaign would run over Christmas. So that hurts the Conservatives because you're going to lose a good week or so where people are interested in the campaign. They're not interested. You're not going to get people going out canvassing. You're not going to have people answering the door and listening to the canvassers. They don't want to. They're eating pie, right? So, the Conservatives, if they are going to even limit the damage, they have to actually claw back some support during the election campaign, which means they need attention. So anything at all that distracts from the election campaign is bad for the Conservatives because Labour are going to be the default winners. Whigs unite, get behind Labour. The Whigs are well gone. What was truly awful about Andy Cooper, aside from not congratulating his opponent, I think he did actually shake her hand. I think there is a photo of him shaking her hand. But everything else was very, very poor, as he didn't even bother to thank those who turned up and vote for him, made turn off even more Tory voters. Yes, I mean, that's a very good point. Conservative activists, they don't have that many of them compared to Labour. And yes, that's very poor. Do bear in mind that Andy Cooper is not likely to be the Conservative candidate for the election. He was an interim. I've forgotten his name. The person who's supposed to be the candidate for Tamworth is a sitting MP because boundary changes are happening. So he's a sitting MP. So he couldn't, without resigning the seat and triggering another by-election. That'd be mad. So this Cooper fella, I think the deal was, if you win the seat, then you'll be able to challenge for it, and then we'll have to get this MP to find another seat. And if you don't win the seat, then this other fella's going to run it in the general election. So that was Cooper's shot, and he really didn't show much effort, did he, at all? Mentioned once, no one would understand my native pronunciation. How do you sound natively? What's that? Hang on. I don't know what that's in reference to. Mention once, no one would understand my native pronunciation. Well, I don't go all Queen's English or anything, but I don't speak to like a wider public like through this. And it's my teacher voice largely, so I don't go full Yorkshire pronunciation on a lot of things because. In fact, even where I am, when I first left home, it wasn't very far. It was 30 miles down the road, and yet in Grimsby, and people couldn't understand everything I was saying in Grimsby. But there we go. Our supporters are sufficiently unmotivated that most couldn't be bothered to come out to vote for us. That's not, that's the good news. Yeah, that's the other thing, isn't it? They're saying, It's just that Conservative voters didn't turn up, and it's like, well, why? I mean, I did make that point in one of my videos. Why do you think that is? And that is not. And again, but it's the same thing they said in 1996. They said the same things, and it was not true then. And it's not going to be true this time. Do I think Starmer will duck out of TV debates and most likely be way ahead? No, he has no need to. There's absolutely no reason for him to at all, because although of course he'll come under attack. Not just from the Conservatives, but from other parties as well. He hasn't. It's like he hasn't got a record. Well, he has got a record, but not in like a government record. And he's quite pleased with his pre-political professional record. So no, he'll be more than happy to take part in the debates. He'll love it. Isn't young Rishi more popular when he's out of the country? Well, it can certainly be argued he's been, although what he said in Israel was unfortunate, his Middle Eastern tour, you can look at it as being like, that's actually decent, because look at what he's been able to do. He's been able to meet, he's been able to go to Israel, he's been able to meet Abbas in Palestine. He's been able to go to Saudi Arabia. So Biden couldn't do that. You know, Biden had to cancel his meetings with Arab leaders, whereas Sunak's been able to go around. So that's actually quite good. How was the Chinese? Very nice, thank you. So that's actually quite good. So yes, Sunak has, I mean, he's not going to achieve anything, let's be honest. The best hope was that he just doesn't make things worse. Like I said, Britain can't really do... All Britain can really do, at best, is increase the level of humanitarian aid. And he may or may not do that. That's the best we can hope for him. But yeah, in terms of his international journeys, fine. Nothing to majorly criticise. Other than it would be nice if he hadn't have just said, we want Israel to win, because you need to be clear what he means. I mean, why couldn't he have just said, we want Israel to succeed in rescuing its citizens from hostage? Why couldn't he just say that? Then that's fine. You know, whereas he says Israel to win, it's like, well, hang on a minute. Because it depends on what you think Israel's aims are. You know, Netanyahu's aims were quite clear, is that Palestine will never exist. So, you know, you need to be a little bit careful there. But anyway, it is what it is. The Tories eating themselves over here and the Republicans eating themselves in the US. Good times. Well, we will see. I mean, these things can turn around very quickly. The Conservatives are not going to, because they're the incumbents, whereas the Republicans in America are not. So it's still, just because they're so incompetent they can't even choose a spokesperson for themselves, doesn't mean that they cannot win the next presidential election. So we'll have to see. And even if they do lose the next presidential election, they could still cause as much of a problem as they did after the last one. There was a suggestion in The Guardian that the by-election results will make Labour more reluctant to have informal deals with the Lib Dems, yet Labour won very narrowly and it was a by-election. Yeah, I've not seen that. I don't know what the thinking of that would be. No, it makes no sense, in fact, at all, because Labour cannot, like, every time a by-election comes up, Labour can target it. They can target anything if it's in a by-election. They can't target every seat in a general election. And the reality is, if you look at, if you think that Labour can probably, it's really hard to even suggest they can target 200 seats. You know, because they've only got, although they've been building up their teams, they've only got so many. Because it's not about just throwing money at it, because each, you know, seat can only spend so much anyway. It's about your strategists. It's about the intelligence on the ground. You can only afford to coordinate so many strategists, analysts, you know, things like that. So there's only so many seats you can really go hard after. And there's almost no seats where Labour and the Liberal Democrats are realistically going to be able to challenge. There's one seat that's directly between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, and that doesn't matter because Conservatives are never going to win that. That's in Sheffield. There's like 2 or 3 where maybe in theory they might both go for it. That's not going to make a big difference, and it's doubtful that they will do that anyway. It might be that those seats are ones where it does become obvious. So no, I see no reason at all for Labour or the Liberal Democrats to be duking it out with each other over individual seats in the general election. They've got clearly defined target seats, and I have no issues there. My only problem is local activists. You know, if you've got a local Labour Party, for example, in an area where the in an area where the Lib Dems want to challenge, let's say Jeremy Hunt's seat, for example. Now, what you really want there is for the local Labour Party to campaign only in the areas where it's not going to cause a problem for the Lib Dems. You basically want them to sort of give the Lib Dems a clear run. Now, if that local Labour Party, who will have a candidate, if they decide to themselves that they don't have this non-aggression pact with the Lib Dems for whatever reason, then that could actually cause a problem because it'll allow the Conservatives to have a better chance of winning. So, yeah, but in terms of the Labour leadership treading on the toes of the Lib Dems targets, that's not going to happen. Phil, I showed a mate your Nigel for Tory leader video and he was so gobsmacked. Giving my mate novel insights I never imagined. That's a bit ambiguous, that. What did he actually take from it? The Lib Dems have predicted they would increase their vote in mid-Bedfordshire, which they did, but that Labour's would stay the same. Many Tories stayed at home. They appeared largely correct. But that was the way it was going to be predicted anyway. The Conservatives are winning mid-Bedfordshire at the next election. The question in this by-election was not how you win it, it's who was going to be best placed to win it, and it was Labour. And the thing is as well, because you might argue to yourself, well, let's say Labour had given the Lib Dems a clear run. The Lib Dems may have won that seat. That's possible. They may well have done. But it's way more damaging for the Conservatives to Labour to win it, because here's the thing. If the Lib Dems had won mid-Bedfordshire, the Conservatives would say, well, you know, this happens a lot. People vote Lib Dem as a protest vote, and then come the general election, the Lib Dems lose that seat. And that's true. That's absolutely true. Can't argue with it. It happens all the time. But if Labour win it, it's like Labour's not a protest vote. In the year before general election, Labour's not a protest vote. Labour is a vote for this is the government we want. And although Labour will lose that seat, unless something goes absolutely insane at the election, it's very damaging because Tory MPs are looking at it and thinking, Labour won a rural seat. Labour won, and that's the second time this year because Selby was very much, it was very, mid-Bedfordshire really should have been an even much safer one than Selby, but, they've done it again. They're encroaching on rural areas. And the way they've done it as well is because Labour did actually run a really good campaign. They actually went out and knocked on people's doors. And if you think, well, that's what they do, isn't it? It's like, no, that's not normally how campaigns are run. The way a campaign's normally run, whether it's a by-election or general election, is you target the areas where you think you can convert votes, you focus your efforts there, which means there's parts of even marginal constituencies where people live where no one ever comes around knocking on their door talking about the election, because people just write them off as, oh, they'll vote this way. So what Labour are doing is they're going to areas, including Tory areas, and knocking on their door. And for a lot of people, this is, it's quite powerful, because for a lot of people, it's like Labour is saying to those people, we actually care about your vote. And Labour can outgun the Tories on that, because For a start, they're a much larger party, so they have more members, therefore more activists anyway. But also at this current time, it's a much tougher slog for a Tory activist than a Labour activist. Labour activists are not getting a load of abuse on the doorstep, not anywhere near as much as a Conservative activist will be. So it's a more pleasant experience for a Labour activist right now than a Conservative one, and they outnumber them. So it means they can go and knock on doors where most of the doors you knock on will be a complete write-off, but you might actually persuade a few people who are non-partisan and will think, well, because I've had a bit of that. I had a bit of that in Selby, where I had a couple of people say, no one comes round here. They said, no one, you're the first people to come round here. So you do get areas like that. Oh, your mate thought Nigel was done and dusted. He'll always be a grifter. I mean, I don't necessarily think he will be in the Tory party. I think he's having another grift here. But, that's what he's always got an angle on something. Do I think Starmer's Middle East statements have cost him much? So his Middle East statements have not cost him anything. The reporting of his Middle East statements are unhelpful. Because again, it keeps being reported. Oh, he said that Israel had the right to withhold water and electricity from Gaza. And it's like, no, he never said that. It was reported that he'd said that, and he never had. Now, where Starmer has gone wrong, I think he's made two mistakes, and I said it at the time. The first is that as soon as his words were being misrepresented, he should have come immediately out and said, no, this isn't what I meant, and clarified it. He has now done that, but it's like, like we'd sort of joke when mainstream media says something that's untrue, then they post the correction on page 27 type thing. This is it, but inadvertently. So because he's now made the clarification so long afterwards, it's allowed the misinformation to run and run. The second mistake I think he's made is in banning council leaders from attending pro-Palestine rallies. Now, I wouldn't have done that. I would have issued guidance to make sure you can't be because on these rallies, the vast majority of people are actually just demonstrating for peace, right? There are some people within those crowds, and there'll be some people speaking at the rallies who are not. They are actually anti-Semites, and worse in many cases, they are actually calling for the murder of Jews, right? There's a small number that'll be like that. So I would have issued guidance that says, if you are going to attend these rallies, here's what you can do to make sure that you are not associated with those small groups, right? Rather than just saying, don't go to those rallies, because that, for me, is a bit poor. I'd have even done the same for backbench MPs. I wouldn't have banned MPs. That's maybe more of a one way you might get away with it. But councillors or council leaders specifically, I would have issued guidance. So that was unhelpful as well. So I think those are where his mistakes are. Say Mandelson seems to have Starmer's ear. Well, he's in the policy committee group. Has recently urged Keir not to give too much power to trade unions if he wins power. Find it worrying that this unelected politician has too much influence. Well, first of all, he hasn't. Second of all politicians have advisors, but the politicians decide policy. And third of all, Labour have already set out and it's workers' rights, not union powers, it's workers' powers. They've already set out what they want to introduce immediately that they come to power in terms of improved workers' rights, right? All they're doing with regarding unions, and all unions really need of them, is to scale back the anti-union laws that the Conservatives have been bringing in the last few years, and still intend to do so. They intend to legislate. They intend to legislate against strikes again next year. So it's just raining back on all of this. But anyway, back to the results of the by-elections, because a few more things worth pointing out as well. The Prime Minister, so in terms of what's been said, so various Tory MPs, backbenchers, ones who can sort of say what they want. Some of them are believing this nonsense that, oh, it was just Tory voters staying at home, they'll be back at the election. Most of those, I get the impression from correspondence, tend to be the newer MPs, the ones who were elected 2017, 2019, so they don't really know what they're on about. Then there are those who can see that it is actually a big problem, but their solution is to actually tack further to the right, which again makes no sense. Then you think, so what's the government's line? Well, the Prime Minister's office is not trying to say that these elections results are fine, but they are blaming the previous MPs, Nadine Dorries and Chris Pincher specifically. They also keep referring to mid-term elections. And it is worth remembering, these are not mid-term elections. Mid-term is 2 or 3 years before the election. It's not 1 year before the election. 1 year before the election is pre-election. You know, and it is important to make the distinction. When it's genuinely mid-term, people are not generally thinking about the general election. That's a lot of the use of the word general there. But they're not thinking of the general election. They're just thinking about which party they prefer, but it's rather abstract. Whereas once you're now getting into the last session of Parliament, people are actively thinking about how they will vote in the general election. So the public's attitude fundamentally changes. So the voting behaviour in a by-election can be significantly different to, when it's just 1 year away from an expected election compared to 2 or 3. So again, number 10, either deluding themselves or trying to delude their supporters. But yeah, just blaming the previous MPs isn't really going to cut it. But we knew they would anyway, because of that fake memo that was, pretend leaked, where it put most of the blame down to Nadine Dorries, really. The other thing to bear in mind is, like, 2 or 3 years out from the election, no one's really campaigning on policies for the manifesto. They're mostly, the main opposition and the government will be talking about the here and now, whereas now it's more long-term. You're starting to see Labour talking about long-term policies rather than just what their policies would be on an issue in the here and now. And the Conservatives are trying to do the same as well, although they haven't really seemed to have any policies. So yeah, the thinking's completely different. And the other thing to note is that these swings that they've been getting, Labour weren't getting these swings prior to 1992. They weren't getting these swings between 2010 and like last year. These swings that they've been getting in the last year are the swings that Labour were getting prior to 1997. It couldn't be clearer. Is there any chance of the Tories pulling off a similar win to Uxbridge in those two coming up by-elections? Blackpool South, not a chance, not a cat in hell's chance, because Blackpool is going back to Labour all day long. Wellingborough, I don't know Wellingborough. I've not heard any suggestion that there would be something like that. So I strongly suspect not. But I don't know Wellingborough at all. But what I would say is that Wellingborough, although it also won a large majority in 2019, it is not as difficult a seat as either Mid Bedfordshire or Tamworth. So Labour, you would put it this way, as soon as the by-election is announced, and I don't know when that will be, because first of all, the suspension has to be confirmed, and that may happen next week, I don't know. But I hope it will, because they're going to prorogue Parliament after next week. So the suspension has to be confirmed. Then a recall petition has to be issued. Now, the recall petition lasts 6 weeks, but of course Peter Bone could resign. He could just announce that he's going to resign from Parliament, in which case there's no need for the recall petition. The by-election will just be issued. It's just that the by-election will not, the writ won't be moved until after Parliament comes back. So Parliament's been prorogued after next week. And I think it's back, the state opening of Parliament, something like the 7th of November, I think. So after that, the writ could be moved if Peter Bone does resign. But if he doesn't resign, then we have to wait for the recall petition. So we'll be, like December. But as soon as it is confirmed, I will be checking the bookies' odds, and as long as it is worth putting a bet on, I will be putting a hefty bet on that immediately. Because Labour are going to win it. I'm absolutely. Unless there is a really weird local issue the Tories can jump on, which I would be very surprised about. But, you know, who knows? Seen unofficial polls saying that Banbury, Oxfordshire could oust Victoria Prentice. I don't think it'll happen, but I'm liking the reaction from Tory neighbours. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know about a lot of individual areas unless I happen to be looking into it, and I tend to look into it if either there's a by-election coming up, at which point I then try and find all the information I can on it, including local election voting, because a lot of people tend to ignore that, or if it happens to be someone very notable. So now that we've got the news that Jeremy Hunt may step down, I will be starting to look very carefully at his area and trying to see why. Because it's not immediately obvious that Jeremy Hunt's seat is in danger, but there is a suggestion, so I need to find out why. Before tomorrow, because I want to do a video on it. Clay's saying, actually working campaigns in America, we primarily do two types of canvassing, persuasion and turnout. Persuasion targets people persuadable, while turnout targets the base who may not turn out. Yes, I mean, the same thing happens in this country. It's just that what Labour have been doing, which they haven't really done in the past, is getting out to as many places as possible. You know, they're going out. They're not going, oh, that area is Conservative, don't even bother. It's like, no, we're going to make an effort, because even if you're large, obviously you don't like do that at the exclusion of the areas where you really think you can convert a lot of people, but every little bit helps. And just the fact, you know, if you've got an area where just no one goes there, they don't. So what you can do as a Labour canvasser, if you go there and you get a comment that's like, oh, no one ever comes round here, it's like, well, we value your vote. Maybe the Conservatives don't value your vote, so they don't bother asking for it, but we do. You know, you can use lines like that. That's quite powerful. So even if you only get a relatively small conversion rate from it, every little helps. From memory, Mordaunt is doomed. Yes. Well, I don't... Her seat is certainly vulnerable, yes. Do I think it's possible Bone will resign and pop up at the general election as a Reform candidate? Do you know? Surely he's been in politics for too long. When did he first win his seat? I think it might have been about 2010. I had it up somewhere. Did I have it up somewhere? No, I didn't. I was looking at it earlier. He's been in politics for long enough now. He's not really going to kill himself on the campaign circuit for no hope. Like, why would he? For no hope? No, there's no point. He'd be much better off trying to wangle himself a seat in the House of Lords, although he may struggle with that now, given the nature of his exit. A lot of rumbling from the farming community down here when I've talked to them, really turn anti-Tory. It just seems to be the elderly keeping the Tories going here in Torbay. Well, it's like that anywhere, but yeah, it's... You know, they really have screwed farmers over. I mean, they've screwed farmers and fishermen over, but the farmers tend to recognise it much more. So should we be looking out for Jeremy Hunt on GB News or Talk TV, or maybe I'm a Celebrity? So, I mean, Jeremy Hunt, of course, already been on GB News, but as a guest. I don't think he's that sort of politician, in all honesty. I don't think he's really cut out for that sort of thing. Bear in mind, Jeremy Hunt, has his own business. He's not one of these MPs that basically, like Jonathan Gullis, that was scratching around for work and then became an MP. You know, he was quite wealthy before he became an MP. And he's got business interests. And as someone who's been a very senior member of the cabinet, what he'll probably be after is a peerage. He'll be after going into the House of Lords. That's probably what he'll be looking at doing. And then running his business. Like, he'll not have time to be messing about on telly. I know you might think that of Jacob Rees-Mogg, but Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't run a business. He he has a lot of money and he gets other people to make more from it for him. Whereas Jeremy Hunt, you will actually just want to run his business, won't he? Heard that Jeremy Hunt seeks one of those having its boundaries changed. It is indeed having its boundaries changed. But if I look at it, even the new boundary is going to be called Farnham and Borden, which I assume is the one. I'd have to look into it, because obviously where you do get boundary change, I suppose it's possible but he would have stayed there surely. But if I look at it, it's very affluent. You know, if you look at the new boundaries taken into account, although it is a Remain voting area, but nonetheless, it's like, you know, 90% car owners, ABC one class 71%, you know, 41% deprivation, which is quite low. Average house price £562,000. I mean, this is an affluent area. It's an affluent area. It's very right wing, slightly liberal. It says here social position 2 degrees lib. So it's not like a place where the culture wars are really going to get you very far. But it is very affluent and is very, very right wing. So yeah, it's. I mean, certainly Labour would have no chance. There'd be no arguments about this one. Who's going to go for this one? Lib Dems. Labour won't touch it. What would be the point? Tom's saying, I think Jeremy Hunt's a reasonably successful businessman, so unlikely to go on GB News. Absolutely, yeah. He made plenty of money before he became an MP. Could Labour's latest victories give the low-tax Tories greater leverage against Sunak, immensely pressure him to adopt economic policies that are further right? Well, that is their plan. I mean, Rishi Sunak's already announced that he's thinking about cutting taxes for the rich, which, you know, I'm sure the fact that he's rich and would benefit hasn't crossed his mind, but, you know, it's, yeah. Anchor saying 1997 election, Dimbleby said, Portillo's not in trouble, is he? And a few minutes later, he lost his seat. Don't like him, but he went with dignity. Yeah, and so would Hunt, I'm sure. That is what this article's talking about when he says he might step down, or he hasn't, but, you know, it's been reported he might step down, that he doesn't want to be the Portillo, which is a really crap reason for stepping down. It's screwing his party over, really is. Could a very large Labour majority be a problem with so many Labour candidates becoming MPs and thus unvetted? No, they're all vetted. Labour have got the infrastructure and they have been spending quite a lot of time. Every candidate has been vetted. Reform UK is the bigger issue there. Like Richard Tice was again saying they're going to stand candidates in every seat in Britain, not Northern Ireland, of course, but in Britain. And I asked him, so how many candidates have you selected already then? I didn't get an answer, but that would be instructive. I mean, how many? Because if they haven't already selected a lot of candidates, they're not going to be vetting them very carefully at all. They haven't got the infrastructure to do it properly anyway. And if they're not already selecting candidates, it means I don't know how serious they are. I'd be interested to know how many they've selected, if any. Maybe they've not selected any, apart from for by-elections. But in terms of the very large Labour majority, it's, you know, you can have an issue that Labour are basically going to have their new MPs potentially outnumber the existing. Well, they will. Realistically, if you look at what's going to happen, the number of new MPs will outnumber the existing MPs. So that will create a logistical challenge for the Whip's office, because you've suddenly got a load of MPs who don't really understand how parliamentary discipline works, and you've got to, like, you know, get them up to speed. At the same time, it means you've got so many votes that you're still going to get all your legislation through really quickly and easily. So I don't see it being... It's one of those... You know how football managers sometimes say, oh, my problem is I've got too many good players? It's that sort of problem. Mandelson hopes GB News survives as it creates division in the Tory party. I don't mind GB News existing. What I mind is that it doesn't take its responsibilities, and Ofcom doesn't force it to take its responsibilities seriously. That's what I mind. I have no issue with GB News if it is made to follow the rules. And as it keeps insisting that it is news, it compares its viewing figures with news programs, and it goes for news awards, then it needs to follow the rules for broadcast news. Instead of saying, when Ofcom's sniffing around, oh no, we're entertainment or current affairs, whatever. And then when they're trying to sell themselves to their supporters, oh no, we're news. You can't have it both ways. It's one or the other. Do I think Stan will really go after the monies taken by the Tories, or will he U-turn? No, he has to go. Like, that's mad. That's a mad question. He has to. How is he going to afford to invest without making, like, they've already said they can't put up taxes on ordinary people because it's they're already squeezed. It's the highest tax rate for like generations. So there's only two ways in which he can afford more investment. I mean, do bear in mind the Tories at the moment are wasting a lot of money on like cronies. So, okay, spending money more efficiently will help. But really, you still need more money as well. And you can get it by removing tax breaks, which they're talking about. Because remember, for a lot of people, they just say, oh, you're higher taxes. It's like, well, yeah, you could justify that in some cases, but you don't really need it when there's so many corporations and wealthy business people, or just wealthy people in general, who are not paying the rate of tax that they should be. So if you just make more people pay the existing rate of tax that they should, then you will raise more taxes. And then the other way is, of course, clawing back money that was defrauded. And there's so much scope for it. We are defrauded out of like 100 or 200 billion pounds a year of taxes. So I'm okay, you'll never get all of that. But if all Labour have to do is invest in more tax collectors, tax investigators, and you will be able to raise a lot more tax. So of course Labour's not going to. Why would he U-turn? Why would he? That'd be madness. Where will Tice find that many nutters? Well, it's quite easy to find nutters who would like to be a parliamentary candidate. The problem is what happens when they've been selected as candidates and it's too late to do anything about it. The election campaign's on. The deadline has passed for candidates and all the rest of it. And then it starts being revealed the shady past of some of these unvetted candidates. That's where the problem comes. What's the prediction for Peterbone seat for the by-election? Labour win all day long. It's an easier seat to win than either of the two Labour won this week. There's absolutely no reason why Labour should not win that. It's not an easy one, but it is easier than both of the ones that fell this week. In reality, actually, Tamworth might be a bit of an illusion, but it's certainly easier than Mid-Bedfordshire. A large number of new MPs and a new government hopefully means they're less inclined towards the Tory-style corruption. This is just the way it's done, darling. Rules are for little people. You would certainly hope there'll be a little bit more. The idealism will be ground out of them by the crushing reality of Parliament, I'm sure. But yes, I think, to be fair, Labour are nowhere near as bad for that anyway, in general. I'm not going to say it's non-existent, but it's... Yeah, I don't think it's anywhere near as serious an issue. In fact, we know it's not. If you look at the MPs that get paid for lobbying, they're almost all Tory MPs, which of course will be going anyway. So it doesn't, the idealism of the new MPs will be largely here nor there because Labour are going to be scrapping a lot because the focus is particularly on stopping MPs being paid for, having jobs as paid lobbyists. Old enough to remember how much of a turd Portillo was. Also, railway enthusiast, and I simply cannot watch his TV programmes, such as my hatred of him. Oh, well. I mean, I don't like watching telly anyway. Although I shall be watching the rugby today when South Africa doubtless will be giving us a bit of a rugby lesson, but never mind. That's pretty much what I watch telly for now, the odd sport, bit of sport. Getting people comfortable with a decent level of tax done fairly, hopefully, means I'll stick around for longer and allow paying down debts, investing, etc. Well, I mean, they have to, again, when people are trying to work out, and I quite understand politicians are politicians, right? So when you're trying to work out what promises are they making in order to get votes, and how much can we trust those promises? If it's something that is in Labour's electoral interests, of course you don't have to doubt that they will at least try and do it. They can fail. You can fail to do something you intend to do, but there'll be no leaving it on the back burner because it's in your interests. It's in Labour's interests to be able to raise as much money as they can without putting up taxes. Because even when people say things like, well, just increase the rate of tax on the rich, like maybe have an extra band, I'd be in favour of that. The worry is, and this is where the Conservatives are quite cunning, they convince ordinary people that they're richer than they really are. So if you look at inheritance tax, for example, that was recent. There was polling showing way more people thought that they will be paying inheritance tax than really will. So when the Tories talk about inheritance tax and reducing it, it actually is appealing to way more people than it should be, because more people think that. So when you talk about raising, do you remember in 2019, there was it like a question time or something, where there was a person in the audience, Jeremy Corbyn was there was a person in the audience who thought that Labour would be charging him more tax because he thought he was, he sort of thought he was poorer and richer than he really was. He had an income of something like, was it 80-something thousand pounds a year? About £80,000 a year. And first of all, he thought, well, actually, I think you'll find there's lots of ordinary people on that. It's not that much. And it's like, no, mate, you're on treble the national average. But also, he thought that he'd be paying more tax. And I think it was worked out that with his salary, whatever it was, he'd be paying about literally £5 more income tax. That's it. But people's perceptions, he thought that he would be on first of all, he thought he was on a fairly ordinary income. And second, he thought he'd be having to shell out way more in tax than he really was going to be. So that is the problem with Labour. So that's why Labour can't really even hint at tax increases, because you might look at it and go, oh, but actually, you won't actually pay more tax. But it's like the ULEZ problem, isn't it? Where the Tesla owner thought they'd be paying ULEZ charges. It doesn't matter what the reality is. It matters what the perception is. So Labour can't talk about higher taxes. So how do they get the money? They get the money by clawing back money that's been defrauded, by removing tax breaks, because that's not raising the rate of tax. That's just saying to some people who are getting out of paying taxes, there's no good reason for you to get out of paying those taxes, so start paying them. So those are the ways. Starmer should offer a moderate Tory to head up a COVID fraud recovery commission. They've already done that. Well, I don't know. No, I don't. Do you mean actually to head it up? Because you are aware, of course, that Labour have said there's going to be a COVID fraud recovery commission. You're just talking about who they appoint. Win-win avoids accusation of Labour bias. I don't think there'll be any accusations of bias, no matter who they appoint. What they should appoint is someone who's good at recovering the proceeds of fraud, ultimately. Although I do find it endlessly hilarious that Starmer is appointing someone to head up a special commission for protecting women in the workplace who need to whistleblow on sexual harassment. I find it endlessly hilarious that he is appointing a former wife of Boris Johnson to do that job. But of course, she is qualified to do it. I mean, that's the important thing. You get someone who can do the job. If people don't see their lives improving, then Labour could end up a one-term government. 100%. Labour absolutely have to. They can't point to a chart. Labour come the following election, they win the next election, the following election, they cannot point to a chart and go, look, economy better. The Tories get away with that. Labour do not, right? People have to feel better. Labour have to be able to knock on doors in 2028 or 2029, whenever it is. They have to be able to knock on doors and say, do you feel better? And they have to be able to say yes. That's the question Labour need to ask. Labour won't be able to talk at people and say, we have made the economy better. They'll have to ask them, do you feel that it's better? And they'll have to ask them every year. They'll have to go out, knocking on the doors. Do you feel that life is better? Have you noticed the improvements in your area? And they need those people to say yes. That is 100% it. And that is why, again, when you're trying to judge whether Labour really are serious about certain things, they need to do that. Otherwise, they will. It's all right talking about the Tory party disintegrating. The Tory party are the natural party of government in our system. That is why they have been in government almost all the time for the last 200 years. If we go with PR, I doubt we'll ever see swings of this size again. Well, I mean, swings... This was a really weird situation anyway, just because of Brexit. Brexit completely broke our political system. But, there it is. Oh, well, Angry Pagan talking about struggling to find a place to live. Landlords still refusing DSS and wanting working professionals. Yes, getting more and more angry at Tories. I mean, this is ultimately the problem when if you're going to sort of talk about something having mostly private provision, but then those private providers don't have to provide the service, that's where it all falls. I mean, it falls down anyway because it's always inefficient. It ends up costing you more than it should. But the system falls down. Everyone needs to be able to be absolutely guaranteed a suitable place to live. It should be an absolute guarantee. In fact, interestingly, in Gordon Brown's paper, which of course was just a research paper, it doesn't mean Labour are adopting it all, or indeed any of it, although I think they're adopting some things. But one of the suggestions in Brown's paper it was almost like, for people who are fans of a codified constitution, which I'm not, but it was almost like that. And one of the things was that everyone should have a right to a decent place to live, that it should be an actual constitutional right. Oh, Derek's reminding me of this person from 2019 who's got better memory than I have. He earned 85,000, thought he was an average earner. Yeah, I don't remember the exact figure he earned, but I remember him thinking that it was quite ordinary. And it was like, no, it's like 3 times ordinary, mate. If you're on 3 times ordinary. Don't get me wrong, I can well appreciate that there are some parts of the country where it's very expensive to live, and that 85,000, you can still be struggling on 85,000, but bloody hellfire, it is not ordinary. It is not ordinary. And again, I'm quite sure that when it was worked out how much extra tax he would pay, it was like a few quid, literally a few quid. Wouldn't even notice it. How can Labour stop the sell-off of the HS2 land? It can't stop it. All it can do is, I've suggested this before. Well, before they'd announced their public inquiry, I suggested that they announce that they will initiate a public inquiry. All they can do is hope that public inquiry will make some potential buyers a bit nervous. But there's nothing they can do to stop it, unless it's possible to stop it in the court. Like if what Rishi Sunak is doing is illegal, then someone could order a judicial review. But Labour wouldn't do that. That would be up for, or could they? But basically, you'd be looking for a non-partisan group to do that. Someone like Good Law Project, maybe. But if it is perfectly legal, there's nothing Labour can do about it, other than try and spook the horses, which is what they are doing. To be fair to them, the day after I suggested that technically 2 days after I suggested that they order a public inquiry. They did do. They announced that at the conference. That's all they can do. Try and get some buyers to think that maybe they're going to have their financial affairs scrutinized by a judge if they get themselves involved in it. But if people feel that they're willing to risk that, or that there's nothing untoward about their finances, then, you know. Surely a proper windfall tax will be a quick and easy win. There's an improvement everyone can see. Labour are indeed in favour of windfall taxes. So although you can understand why they won't bother shouting a lot about it, partly from anything else, because remember what a windfall tax is. It's not a tax on what you might think are excessive profits. It's purely a tax on unexpected profits. Will there be any unexpected profits still taking place when they're in power? Who knows? So it's not worth Labour singing about it. But yeah, if there's still a situation where windfall profits are being earned, and Labour have already got an established policy of using windfall taxes, applying windfall taxes, then yeah, Labour could absolutely make use of that. But we may find that a lot of those windfall profits have already been made by the time they come to power. Just missed out on the stream. Well, the good thing, Viv, is that it will be available for playback. Mostly just been answering questions. I actually intended to go through quite a lot more on the by-elections, but there we go. All I hear is landlords wailing in gnashing their teeth about how put on they are. Cheeky guess. I mean, some of them will be struggling as well. But at the same time, no one forces you to be a landlord, whereas some people are forced to rent. So, you know, that's my attitude on that one. I have to say my experience of private landlords is largely good. I've had 3 private landlords in my life. The first one was not so good. You know, the ceiling downstairs collapsed almost on my head, and they didn't really do a lot about it. So even when I moved out, over half a year later, the ceiling was still on the floor. But the other 2 I've had have been brilliant. Can't fault them. Really nice. And they did not go jacking up the price of my rent all the time. In fact, the last landlord I had in Scunthorpe, you know, I lived there for, I think, 6 years. And in that 6 years, he put up the cost of the rent once by £50 a month, and which is a proportion of what I was paying was not that much. And, you know, he sort of apologised as well. He was doing it, saying just, you know, these costs are now just going up, which is fine, you know. So and he was really good as well at getting on when something wasn't working, because the central heating was a right mess. But every time something wasn't working, he was straight on it. There's no messing about. So, you know, there are good ones. So that's the important thing. Are they, you know, if you've got a good landlord, then, you know, it's sort of okay. You're still paying more than if we had, you know, nationalised housing, like social housing, decent social housing. But you can get good ones, but you can also get really bad ones. Who was that fella? There was someone who owns, this is going back years now, and he owns like a lot of housing for, and he rents to people. Generally, rents to people on lower incomes as well. And he like it was by being interviewed, and he actually referred to them as like vermin or something. He considers these people to be subhuman. His own customers, the people who make him very rich. You know, so you do get some like that. The government should pause its sale of land acquired for phase 2 of HS2 for up to 3 years. Its independent advisor on infrastructure has told BBC News. Yeah, but they will pay no attention to it because the Tories are not interested in doing what is in the national interest. They are interested in screwing over Labour as much as possible when they now know that Labour are coming to power. This is what I'd feared. Like, I'd sort of hoped, as much as we might take the piss out of any Tory MPs who currently think, oh yeah, they've got a chance in the election, I sort of hoped they'd carry on thinking that. Because the most dangerous Tories of all are the ones who know they're going to lose and they're comfortable with losing, because that means as long as they don't do anything that might land them in court and in prison afterwards, it means there's nothing they won't do. So they are now ripping the copper wiring out of the walls. That's what they're doing at the moment. And so they will not care. And, you know, so they see it as in their interest to screw the country over as much as possible in order to screw Labour over as much as possible. They want it to be as, because their worst case scenario is that Labour come in and instantly make things noticeably better. So they have to knacker the economy as much as they can. They have to completely bugger the economy up. It would be different if it was just that Labour were likely to win the next election, but the Tories were in it. That would be different, because then the Tories would have to think, well, what if we win it? We have to make sure that we can sort of work. But as soon as they realise they're definitely losing, then, you know, they're just nicking anything that's not nailed down and salting the earth. And this is going to be a really dangerous period of time. I shudder to think how bad everything's going to be when the election does come. The state should own all houses which are rented and rent them. I think this is one of the most left-wing views. And so my attitude is I have absolutely no issue with the private sector. My only issue is when people are dependent on it. You know, so for essential services, which includes housing, there should always be options for people. So my attitude is that the government shouldn't just set housing targets. They should actively build houses like these are the government's houses. The problem is, and this is why, although I think that that's the best solution, I know it's not a credible solution, is because as soon as the Tories come back in, they just sell them all off cheap. They just sell them off cheap. That way, they've made themselves some new voters, because these people who were renting these houses, you sell it cheap to those people, all of a sudden they become Tory voters, because one, they're homeowners, and two, they're homeowners who bought the home for less than it's worth thanks to the Tories. So instantly they've created a load of voters, you know. So that's why I sort of, although I believe having state-owned homes would be the best solution and the cheapest solution for people, I also recognise that it's not pragmatic, because they just go. So what instead you need to be able to do is just make sure there's access to enough housing, that if you've got to work on the basis that market forces are going to impact the rate of rent, then you just have to make sure there's enough housing to stop it taking the piss. That's all you can do. Louise coming back there with the hunt to quit as an MP. Yeah, we don't know for certain. And I have read it. I've talked about it a little bit. I will be doing a video tomorrow. We don't know for certain, but the prospect is very interesting, much more interesting than something. Don saying they're salting the earth. Yes, that is what. And when I say they, I want to draw a distinction here. I mean people like Rishi Sunak. I don't mean the whole Tory party. There are plenty of Tory MPs that aren't doing this, and I don't mean because they're decent people. I mean because it's not in their interests. Not every Tory MP is happy about the idea of losing the next election. Certainly there are Tory MPs who are not pocketing millions, and if they lose their seat, then their earning potential is a bit iffy. So there are definitely Tory MPs who will not at all be happy about the idea of heading towards certain defeat, where their seat becomes more and more vulnerable, because the more the government behave like this, the more annoying they are going to be in the eyes of voters. So at the moment, you know, you look at the situation, the Tories could be left with 200 seats, right? Well, if they carry on as they're doing and they have the election next summer, they might be left with only 150 seats. If they carry on what they're doing and go all the way till next autumn or January 2025, they might only be left with 100 seats. You know, the difference between at least trying to get voters on board and not could be like 100, 150 seats difference. Rob, I'm almost going to agree into your last two words. We need a national house building programme with construction of eco homes. Yes. IKEA style. No. No, we want ones that work. Current Tories are far more destructive than back in Major's time. 100%, yes. At least back in the 90s, they were vaguely competent and tried to look after the electorate. Yes, I would agree with that. They were, Tory sleaze was very much the watchword. They couldn't behave themselves. John Major was like tearing his hair out at the behaviour of his cabinet colleagues. And if he made a mistake, it was by being, as well as, besides knobbing Edwina Currie, if he made a mistake, it was by being too loyal to cabinet colleagues who were costing the party's reputation. Like in leadership, you have to put your party ahead of personal loyalties. You've really got to. If you're going to be a leader, you've got to do that. And he didn't, so that was a mistake. But yes, they were generally competent, by and large. They were competent. And now they're not competent, and as well as deeply corrupt. It's like there's nothing, very genuinely, I can think of nothing you could say, no matter what your politics is, that if I was to ask anyone, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, name me something good about this Conservative government, and do you know what? I don't think anyone could do it, truthfully. I think it could be like Brexit, where they can come up with some spurious bollocks, like, oh, but we've got our sovereignty back, or something like that, or something that doesn't exist. Like, oh, we've got bendy bananas now. It's the same thing. I don't think anyone could truthfully say anything good about this Conservative government at all. Because even if you look at what Rishi Sunak is doing well, so you can look at, for example, things like, improving relations with the EU with the Windsor Framework. Well, who broke those relations? Who broke those relations? The Tories. So that's not really in their favour. It's like they smashed your Ming vase and Rishi Sunak has picked up a couple of the pieces, not even glued them together. You look at this tour of the Middle East. That's a useful thing to be doing, I hope, but it's not going to achieve anything. And for all we know, it's not necessarily diplomatic brilliance on Sunak's part. It could just be that Britain is seen as much less offensive than the US. So it was easier for Sunak to get those meetings than it would have been for the US president. So you can't really point at anything the Conservatives are doing well that's real and that we wouldn't get with a Labour government. So it's like, well, what is the point of them? Why are a quarter of the electorate still saying they're going to vote for them? For goodness sake. Gullis is the definition of unemployable. Yeah. Well, he was a supply teacher. Apparently not a very good one. Although I will be fair, I've done supply teaching. It's bloody hard. It's quite hard to be a good supply teacher, I think. But there we go. Right, we're sort of run out of time. We'll have to leave it there. I'm afraid we've gone well over time. But thanks very much for coming on. We'll be back on again next week. Mike's just mentioned shorts again. I may do a little video later in the week, where I discuss what I'm aiming to do with shorts. I'm waiting for I've got a bit more data so that I can decide myself. But I will sort of do another little update on what I'm aiming to do with those. But thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a very good evening. And until next time, I'll say see you later.